The man collapsed to the ground. His joints creaked all over his body. His finger bones strangely elongated, and his cheekbones became protruding. Sharp nails pierced through his fingertips. The man had transformed into a half-man, half-wolf creature. Legends of werewolves quickly began to circulate. In early 1995, a hiker went missing in the remote mountains of central Oregon. Some residents of the isolated community began to speculate that the missing man had likely contracted an animal-borne virus, known as mountain fever. This virus is also called wolf's face. Blake grew up in the Oregon mountains. As a child, he often followed his father hunting in the mountains. One day, Blake chased his prey and ran into the forest alone. Through the scope, he saw a strange creature. By the time he snapped back to reality, the creature had vanished. The rough breathing of a beast could be heard in the woods. He nervously scanned his surroundings. His father suddenly grabbed Blake and warned him not to run off. A noise came from the hillside in the distance. His father quickly raised his gun and pulled Blake to hide in the hunting cover first. The beast's heavy breathing grew closer and closer. His father held the hunting rifle. Sounds of beasts fighting could be heard below. After the sounds of the struggle faded away, he dared to stand up and check his surroundings. Not far away lay the body of a doe. Then a shadow darted past. His father fired a shot and took his son home before it got dark. That night, Blake eavesdropped on his father's conversation with a friend.
I saw it.
So what?
You know what I'm talking about.
The face of the wolf?
His father wanted to take his friend to hunt down the wolfman in the woods, to prevent it from attacking his children. Blake accidentally made a noise, catching his father's attention. He hurriedly ran away. 30 years later, Blake had moved far away from that remote mountain area. He built a family and career in San Francisco. He had a lovely daughter named Jingjie. The father and daughter interacted like friends. Blake didn't want to be a strict father like his own dad. He wanted to give Jingjie a perfect childhood. Blake's wife Shirley was a successful career woman. Their marriage was like a still pond. One day, Shirley returned home with a document about an inheritance. It turned out that Blake's father had gone missing years ago. He had recently been officially declared dead. Therefore, the house in Oregon was bequeathed to the sole heir. Blake, although his relationship with his father wasn't close, he still felt uneasy upon hearing the news. This made him realize that Shirley and Jingjie were his only remaining family. Blake didn't want this family to fall apart as well. He took the initiative to invite Shirley and Jingjie to leave the city together to vacation at his childhood home. As for Shirley's job, she could work remotely. After discussing it, they set off immediately. The family arrived in Oregon. They hadn't reached their destination yet when they were blocked by a roadblock ahead. Blake took out his phone to check the navigation. He discovered that there was no signal in this area. Jingjie was full of curiosity about everything. She saw a figure deep in the woods. She told her father that the stranger was coming over. Shirley was very anxious because the visitor was carrying a long hunting rifle. Blake explained that everyone here carried guns. He then rolled down the window to ask for directions. After inquiring, he learned that the visitor was the son of his father's friend, Derek. They had been childhood playmates. Derek explained that the main road to his house was closed. "I can take you on a shortcut," Derek said, then got into the passenger seat. Not long after the car drove out, the sky gradually darkened. They chatted casually. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the road. Blake hurriedly swerved the steering wheel to avoid it. The car crashed into the woods and hung on the edge of a cliff. When Blake regained consciousness, he realized the entire car was tilted. His first priority was to check the safety of his wife and daughter. Just as he was about to ask Derek a few questions, Derek suddenly yanked open the car door and tumbled out. Shirley climbed out of the car with her daughter first. Blake was about to follow them out when he heard a series of beastly breaths. He leaned out to close the passenger door. Blake saw Derek collapsed on the ground. A hairy arm suddenly smashed through the window. Blake instinctively shielded his face. His arm was cut by the shards of glass. Before he could regain his senses, Derek was dragged away by an unknown creature. This was no place to stay. Blake hurriedly crawled out of the car and hurriedly left the forest with his wife and daughter. Fortunately, his childhood memories gradually returned. He finally found his father's house. At this moment, they heard the sound of a car overturning behind them. They were frightened and quickened their pace into the house. Blake held onto the door until the strange noise outside disappeared. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. Blake quickly checked the doors and windows. Then he went into the basement to pull the circuit breaker. The lights in the room flickered a few times before stabilizing. Jingjie, frightened, went to bed early, but Blake couldn't fall asleep. He checked the yard through the window and planned to stay by his daughter's side all night. Jingjie couldn't help but ask her father, "Did that uncle just die?" Blake felt a wave of guilt at her words. He feared that this incident would cause psychological trauma to his daughter.
Sometimes when you're a daddy, you're so scared of your kids getting scars that you become the thing that scars.
After calming his daughter, Blake went to discuss things with Shirley. He thought they should block the front door. If that thing crashed against it again, the whole door would come down. Shirley wasn't as easily fooled as Jingjie. She questioned her husband about what the thing outside was, but Blake had left home a long time ago, and he wasn't well acquainted with the Oregon mountains, and didn't know the true identity of that creature. He had only caught a glimpse of it while driving. The beast was actually walking upright on two legs. As Blake spoke, he moved a cabinet to block the front door for the night. The couple thought they should call for help, because the signal was weak in the mountains. Blake decided to dig out his father's radio equipment. To his surprise, after trying for a long time, there was no response. He caught a familiar scent. Shirley looked confused. "Why can't I smell anything?" Following the scent, Blake opened a hidden door. Inside, there were 3 huge hams hanging. He picked up a small piece of meat from the cutting board and popped it into his mouth. A sharp pain shot through his teeth. Blake thought he had just hit his jaw in the accident, but to his shock, he spat out a tooth. Shirley rummaged through the medical kit for gauze to stop the bleeding. She rolled up Blake's sleeve and finally saw the wound on his arm. Shirley used alcohol to disinfect Blake's wound. Upon closer inspection, it didn't look like a cut from glass shards. Instead, it resembled a claw mark from an animal. Since they couldn't get in touch with anyone on the radio, Blake told his wife and daughter to rest first. He continued to reinforce the front door. However, as he hammered in the nails, Shirley couldn't sleep at all. Blake was drenched in cold sweat. Every time he tried to nail something, things went wrong. The injured hand throbbed with pain. His throat felt dry. Blake leaned over the sink and drank water desperately. Then he turned to scan the living room. He seemed to have heard some movement, circling back and forth in the house. Blake made his way to a room on the second floor. He saw a spider crawling on the wall. This subtle sound was amplified hundreds of times, and roared loudly in Blake's mind. If he had paid more attention to the town's legends as a child, he might have guessed that he could be infected with mountain fever. Unfortunately, the Blake of now knew nothing. He nervously walked downstairs and gestured for his wife on the sofa to be quiet. It turned out that the beast was circling the house. Blake slowly approached the door. He leaned in to listen to the sounds outside. Suddenly, a hand suddenly reached in and grabbed his ankle, dragging him down. Shirley was frozen in fear. Blake kicked and struggled desperately. He tried to reach for the hammer nearby. Seeing this, Shirley suddenly snapped back to reality. She quickly grabbed the hammer and rushed to help. The beast released Blake and ran away. The family was still in shock. They couldn't regain their composure for a long time. In the early morning, Blake couldn't feel a bit of sleepiness. He flipped over and left the sofa, faintly hearing Shirley's voice. Blake followed the sound into the basement. He found Shirley kneeling in front of the radio, desperately calling for help.
My husband is sick. If anyone can hear me, please call someone to help. We were attacked by some kind of animal, and I think my husband...
Shirley hopelessly placed the receiver down. She realized someone was behind her, and quickly turned around. Blake stood in the darkness. He tried to speak to his wife, but only a faint whisper escaped his throat. A puddle of urine trickled down his pant leg. Shirley struggled to remain calm. She first helped Blake upstairs to rest. Jingjie was awakened by the sound of her parents' voices. Blake lowered his head to avoid his daughter's gaze. He could sense something was wrong with him now. Blake couldn't help but scratch his head. He realized his hair was falling out. Seeing her husband unable to speak, Shirley brought out paper and a pen to communicate with him. She didn't expect Blake's grip on the pen was also deteriorating. Shirley looked at her weakened husband, and for the first time realized she couldn't lose Blake. She stayed by the sofa and kept talking to her husband. However, Blake's condition gradually worsened.
You need my help.
What is happening? I can't understand you.
Shirley also heard her husband's unintelligible mutterings. She noticed that Blake's hand was bleeding. When she unwrapped the bandage, Shirley realized that his wound was worsening. Blake was stimulated by the smell of blood, and suddenly became restless. He couldn't help but scratch at the bloody wound, and bent down to gnaw at his own flesh. Shirley was frozen in fear, unable to move. Meanwhile, Blake was completely oblivious. Gradually, even his teeth began to fall out. Finally, Blake stopped chewing. He looked at his wife. Shirley realized that Blake needed medical attention. She walked to the window to check the yard. Shirley saw a car parked next to the shed. She ran into the basement to find the keys and a spare battery. Shirley grabbed a kitchen knife for protection. She led Blake and their daughter out through the back door. The three of them got into the dusty old car. Shirley opened the hood and connected the battery. Jingjie turned to look at her father. She realized that his face had already distorted. At this moment, Shirley returned to try to start the car. To her surprise, although this car was old, it could still be started. Shirley was overjoyed. She quickly retracted the battery to get ready to leave. As she turned on the windshield wipers, the face of the wolfman appeared. He smashed the glass and started grabbing randomly. Shirley picked up the knife and slashed at him. Jingjie opened the car door and ran away. She pulled her mother out of the car with her. Blake followed closely behind. The family of three ran to the side of the plastic greenhouse and set up a ladder to climb up. The wolfman quickly approached on all fours. Blake immediately retracted the ladder. The wolfman couldn't reach the top of the greenhouse. Instead, he simply crawled into the greenhouse. The fragile structure couldn't support the weight of three people. It seemed that the wolfman had noticed this. He kept jumping up to hit the roof of the greenhouse. The plastic membrane quickly tore open. Jingjie slipped through the opening. Fortunately, her parents caught her just in time. Blake realized they couldn't continue like this. He jumped down from the greenhouse to draw the wolfman's attention. Meanwhile, Shirley took their daughter back to the house.
You left him! You left Daddy outside! He's gonna get hurt! He's gonna die! You left Daddy alive!
No, he was trying to protect you!
The reason why Jingjie reacted so strongly was because only her father was willing to accompany her since childhood. The relationship between mother and daughter was very cold. Fortunately, Blake quickly appeared. Shirley opened the back door to let him in. Jingjie approached the disfigured Blake. She wanted to awaken her father's senses. Blake straightened up and spat out a large puddle of blood. In the blood were severed fingers of the wolfman. Probably Blake bit off the werewolf during the fight just now. He lunged closer to Shirley. However, she didn't show any signs of fear. Blake focused on his wife's familiar eyes to regain a bit of his sanity. He walked to the door, intending to distance himself from his family. Suddenly, the wolfman outside lunged in. The two fell to the ground and fought fiercely. They rolled into the dining room. This time, the old wolfman was aggressive. Blake was overpowered. Shirley grabbed a knife and stabbed it into the wolfman's back. Then she took her daughter and ran away. Shirley told Jingjie to hide in the bedroom first. She stayed behind to face the wolfman herself. The wolfman had a mangled left hand. His nose kept spewing air. It was clear he wanted revenge for his severed fingers. Blake rushed in front of the wolfman to protect his wife. He was hit against the wall by the creature and suffered consecutive heavy blows, gradually losing the strength to resist. Fortunately, Shirley didn't give up on rescuing her husband. She grabbed a metal rod to attack the wolfman and divert its attention. Blake seized the opportunity to launch a surprise attack. He bit through the wolfman's throat and stared at the enemy, slowly gasping for breath. But he inadvertently caught a glimpse of a tattoo on the wolfman's wrist. Blake realized that this wolfman was his father. It turned out he hadn't died. He was just infected with mountain fever virus and hiding in this forest. Blake rushed out of the house quickly. He didn't want to lose his sanity like his father. Blake hadn't gone far before he fell to the ground and convulsed. His bones cracked and creaked all over. His palms elongated like a beast's. His cheekbones became unusually prominent. Blake's wolf-like features became increasingly pronounced. His entire sensory perception underwent a drastic change. So many unexpected events had occurred tonight, but Shirley had to be strong for her daughter. Just then, the overhead lights suddenly went out. She walked to the door and saw the fully transformed Blake through the glass. The next moment, he leaped onto the roof. Shirley could only determine his location by sound. She picked up the knife from the ground and approached the stairs to the second floor. Shirley was so tense that she didn't dare to breathe. She turned her head and found the werewolf right in front of her daughter. Shirley hurried forward to shield Jingjie. Taking advantage of the wolfman's injury, she quickly took her daughter out of the room. The mother and daughter ran into the warehouse and barricaded the door. Shirley quickly scanned the inside of the warehouse. She grabbed a chain from the shelf and collected any useful tools. At this point, the wolfman had reached the door outside. He slammed against the door several times, finding it quite sturdy, so he began to dig a hole at the bottom of the wooden door. In the pitch-black warehouse, difficult for the human eye to see objects, but Blake's evolved beast eyes could clearly see Shirley and her daughter. Unfortunately, he didn't notice the trap beneath him. Shirley immediately fled with her daughter. Blake was trapped in place by the chain, unable to move. He howled at the sky and began to gnaw at his own ankle. After several minutes, Blake bit off his trapped right leg. He slowly crawled out of the warehouse. On Shirley's side, she and her daughter ran frantically. Blake was chasing behind them. His furious roars echoed throughout the woods. Shirley looked around and noticed a severed arm on the ground. It turned out they had reached the spot where the accident occurred. That arm must belong to Derek. Shirley followed the trail to search ahead. Sure enough, she found Derek's shotgun. Blake was lying on the car roof, watching them. Shirley and her daughter hid in a nearby treehouse. Blake crawled over with his broken leg to sniff. Shirley saw his breath behind the fence and realized Blake had climbed up. She raised the shotgun, aiming at his head, but she couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. After all, the man before her had once been her husband.
Mommy, he wants this to be over.
Shirley steeled herself and shot the wolfman dead. Blake fell to the ground, looking up at the sky as he gradually lost his breath. At this moment, the sunlight had illuminated the entire mountain area. Shirley led her daughter out of the forest. The two of them looked at the scenery before them. It dispelled the clouds of sadness in their hearts. The film ends here. Director LaVanna is a friend of James Wan. Compared to his notable work The Invisible Man, this film Wolfman is clearly a step down. Firstly, the plot uses the werewolf concept to reveal the familial connections across 3 generations. Blake wants to escape his original family, to avoid becoming an abusive parent like his father. He tries to lower his guard and befriend his daughter, but he often used foul language and couldn't control his bad temper. His daughter reminds him repeatedly. Blake escapes from the mountains to San Francisco, but he doesn't escape his father's influence on him. This deeply rooted negative trait in his blood is like a virus transmitted through blood. On the surface, it's about Blake being infected with mountain fever by his father, but in reality, it's about the impact of the original family on him. In the end, the story leads to the tragic conflict between father and son, culminating in a fateful conclusion. Unfortunately, the plot is too bland and lacks highlights. It is neither touching nor frightening. Fortunately, the artistic style and cinematography are quite good. Enjoying the beautiful mountain scenery isn't a waste of time.